Darren McGavin, the Night Stalker.
It's been over 50 years since the Night Stalker captivated audiences and changed pop culture forever. The made-for-TV movie starring Darren McGavin began as an unpublished novel called The Kolchak Papers, written by Jeff Rice, a newspaper writer and budding actor. Rice had trouble shopping the rights to his unpublished novel around town, until sometime in the early 70s when ABC made him an offer to option his manuscript for television. It would end up being adapted by legendary writer Richard Matheson into the TV movie we now know as The Night Stalker. Yes, this same Richard Matheson responsible for works like I Am Legend, which would spin off into its own major motion pictures, and Twilight Zone episodes like The Invaders and Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. The film would be produced by Dan Curtis, the man known for the vampire soap opera Dark Shadows. With Dark Shadows being such a huge hit, Dan would go on to direct 2 Dark Shadows films for MGM. The first being the 1970 House of Dark Shadows, followed a year later by Night of Dark Shadows. With over 1,200 episodes under his belt and 2 films, Dan figured he had done all he could with television directing and producing. That was until he received a phone call from Barry Diller, Vice President of Development at ABC at the time. Barry offered him a project that he just couldn't turn down: the chance to direct a horror picture written by Richard Matheson. Dan was elated. He was a huge fan of Richard's and couldn't wait to work on the film. One issue though, he didn't want to direct. Barry said, "Fine, you can produce then, but you'll need to hire a director," and he sent Dan the script. Dan flew to California to have a meeting with Matheson over the notes he made about the script. However, Matheson, known for being a little standoffish, barely even blinked during their meeting. It wasn't until Matheson looked over Dan's notes that he realized Dan knew what he was doing, and his cold nature began to melt. With writing duties taken care of, now came the directing. Since Dan didn't want to do it himself, he needed to find someone. Back in the late 60s, Dan had been searching for a director for his 1968 horror film, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He interviewed tons of potential directors, and that's where he met director John Moxey. Moxey had directed some episodes for an anthology series called Armchair Theater, and that's what caught Dan's attention. So he hired Moxey on for his Jekyll and Hyde film. However, due to unforeseen circumstances, Moxey had to leave the project. However, Dan never forgot about him. Years later, when it came time to find a director for The Night Stalker, Dan remembered John Moxey and hired him on for the job. The most integral part of the movie was going to be finding Kolchak himself, though this would be fairly easy as Dan already had a name in mind: Darren McGavin. After Dan had read Matheson's script, he knew Darren, and only Darren, would be the right fit for Kolchak. However, Darren almost didn't get the role. His agent received the script from Dan and thought it was too out there even for Darren. Fearing he would hate it, his agent almost didn't send it to him. He eventually gave in and sent the script because previously Darren had implemented a rule that he was to be given any script that came his way, no matter how good or bad it may appear. And it's a good thing his agent listened, because Darren really liked the script. He signed on, and the rest is history. The original version of Kolchak wore Bermuda shorts and Hawaiian t-shirts. Darren described him as being sort of a swinger, but when he came into the show, Darren turned Kolchak into something else entirely. There were no Bermuda shorts or Hawaiian shirts. Instead, he wore an outdated seersucker suit, straw hat, white buck shoes, and a button-down shirt. Darren said, "He just hasn't bought any clothes since 1955. He's a man of his time, and I love him." Nobody really expected much from The Night Stalker, including the film's producer Dan Curtis. Here is a little horror film that nobody really gave a second thought about, but they had something more special on their hands than they really knew. Before the movie aired on television, they had a packed industry screening at Fox Studios. Dan and Barry Diller kept to the back of the theater, and they couldn't believe the reactions the film was getting. People were gasping and screaming. After that experience, they knew their little horror film would be a hit. But regrettably, Barry looked at Dan and said they should have released the movie as a feature and not a TV movie. Still, even with the reception they received from their peers, they had no idea just how big it was going to be. The movie took 12 days to film and cost approximately $450,000. It told the story of Carl Kolchak, a reporter in Las Vegas who believes a serial killer in the area may in fact be a vampire. It aired on January 11th, 1972 as part of ABC's Movie of the Week.
Tuesday Movie of the Week. Presenting the world premiere of an original motion picture produced especially for ABC.
May I introduce myself? My name is Kolchak of the Daily Chronicle.
Just an average Tuesday against average TV programming. But something happened. Either it was the marketing or the reviews, but something caught the public's interest, because the next day when the overnights came in, the movie had received 54% of the TV viewing audience, making The Night Stalker the most watched TV movie of all time up to that point. Of course, because of its success, this meant one thing and one thing only: sequels. Richard Matheson and Dan Curtis would team up once again to bring The Night Strangler to the small screen the very next year. For this sequel, Dan would take the directing and producing duties and would see Darren return as the investigative reporter Kolchak. This time on the streets of Seattle as another set of serial killings start up, all targeting exotic dancers who all seem to have died due to strangulation and blood loss. The second film, while not as successful ratings-wise as the first, was still a massive hit. A third film was planned but never came to fruition as the studio felt a show would be much more lucrative. However, the proposed third film would have been called The Night Killers. It would have taken place in Honolulu, Hawaii, and would have Kolchak investigating a UFO, a nuclear power plant, and government officials being killed and replaced with androids. It would all lead to Kolchak believing that a top-secret plan to colonize the Earth by aliens was taking place, and he would be the only one capable of exposing it. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Well, wait, because we're not quite there yet. After The Night Strangler, ABC would begin negotiations with Darren on returning for the series, but both Dan Curtis and Richard Matheson declined. Darren was also given an executive producer role in the series, even though he was never formally given credit. However, Jeff Rice, the man who ABC acquired the original story from, never got any permission from Rice to go ahead with the show. He actually found out about it in the April 24th, 1974 issue of Daily Variety. Contractually, the studio was required to get permission from Rice on any series or films that they may want to make, but instead just went ahead anyways without even telling him. Rice was livid. His lawyer contacted Universal, who was putting the show together, and they refused to talk, even going as far as to ban him from the lot and not answer any of his phone calls. Eventually, Rice sued, and the entire thing was settled out of court prior to the show airing. Rice would at least get a created by credit at the beginning of the episodes, but after everything he went through, he deserved a lot more. The first 4 episodes of this series would be titled simply as The Night Stalker, but after a brief hiatus, the show came back with the new revamped title of Kolchak, The Night Stalker. This was done largely because the network heads were worried people would get confused and think they were about to watch the movie that they had enjoyed 2 years prior and not a new television series based on the movies. I don't know why studio executives think their viewers are so stupid, but I did get angry as a kid when I saw Ghostbusters in the TV guide, and it was the show with the gorilla and not the real Ghostbusters. So I kind of understand where they're coming from. The show was set primarily in Chicago, but was mostly filmed in Los Angeles and Universal Studios. The show boasted tons of guest stars, from the beautiful Julie Adams, known for her role in The Creature from the Black Lagoon, to Tom Skerritt, who played Captain Dallas in the fantastic sci-fi horror film Alien. Along with the cast, there were also some first-timers that would cut their teeth on the show, like David Chase, the creator of the hit show The Sopranos, who would work as a story editor, and Robert Zemeckis, director of the Back to the Future films and producer on Tales from the Crypt. Kolchak the Night Stalker created the Monster of the Week formula that many shows would later employ. One week, Kolchak could be investigating a werewolf, and the very next, he could be investigating an invisible alien that sucks out the bone marrow of its victims. There was nothing too wacky or far-fetched for Kolchak. However, as time went on, the ratings began to decline, and even the show's star Darren began to become bored with it all. The show mostly aired Friday nights at 10 p.m., which for a show trying to capture the younger market was a death sentence. Most younger kids are out with their friends on a Friday night, not sitting around waiting for a television show to come on. The show would be moved down to 8 p.m., and then would later show reruns the following night, also at 8, during the last 4 weeks of the show's run. Darren was tired of the Monster of the Week formula, often finding himself rewriting the scripts because he just didn't like how they turned out. In fact, they threw out many scripts because Darren thought they sucked. In a 1983 interview with Fangoria magazine, Darren said, "How many monsters can you go through? It's silly. you're gonna do the werewolf, you're gonna do the vampire, you're gonna do the zombie, and when you run out of those, what other stories are you gonna tell? It was actually Darren who told the executives to pull the plug on the show. I called up the network and said, let's cancel this goddamn thing. You're losing money, we're losing money, and I'm tired and I don't want to do anymore. Why don't we just stop? 3 hours later, they canceled the show. After the cancellation of the show, 2 more made-for-TV movies were thrown together, which were really just unaired episodes that they stitched together with some added narration from Darren to try and make them into 2 cohesive films. In 1979, CBS brought Kolchak back by airing the 4th episode, The Vampire, as their CBS late movie.
And now, Night Stalker, starring Darren McGavin.
And it was a huge hit. Not quite as huge as the original Night Stalker, but huge nonetheless. Kolchak would come and go over the years, but it wasn't until the 90s that the 2 stitched together films would be pulled apart and allowed to be shown on CBS as their individual episodes. Even though Kolchak ended with only 1 season and 20 episodes, it was supposed to have 26. This means there are 6 unproduced scripts floating around out there, but we do know what 3 of them may have been about. First, there's Eve of Terror by Stephen Lord. This episode would have been a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type story, but with a feminist twist. It was the 70s after all. The second script, called The Get of Belial, written by Don Mullally, would feature Kolchak investigating a small-town mining community besieged by a backwoods family of inbreds. And the third script, The Executioners, written by Max Hodge, has a demoted Kolchak investigating a strange painting that is connected to a bizarre series of murders. Both Eve of Terror and The Get of Belial would be adapted by Moonstone Comics. Even though Kolchak was a short-lived series, it had quite the impact on popular culture. It helped create the Monster of the Week formula, and without it, you likely wouldn't have shows like The X-Files, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or Supernatural. The X-Files in particular owes much of its existence to the series. Chris Carter has come out and stated that even though The X-Files is inspired by things like The Twilight Zone and Outer Limits, the biggest inspiration came from Kolchak. He's even gone on to pay tribute to the show in many ways. First, you have Senator Richard Matheson, obviously named after the writer responsible for the TV movie being a success in the first place. He even tried to get Darren in to play Senator Matheson, but he turned it down. Chris tried again to get Darren to play Mulder's father, but again he turned it down. Chris at one point even pitched the idea of Darren coming in as Kolchak himself, but yet again it was turned down. But what a missed opportunity that was. Imagine Kolchak and Mulder on the same screen together. Chris would finally get Darren to come on the show as FBI agent Arthur Dales, the very first agent to ever investigate the X-Files. So they basically got Kolchak, but not Kolchak. The X-Files also has a few other similarities to the Kolchak TV films, like the previously discussed colonization plot from the unfilmed third entry, which is basically the majority of the X-Files mythology story arc. Or, and spoilers for the Night Strangler, but the main villain in that film kills every 21 years, using the blood of his victims to keep himself from aging, which sounds a lot like Tooms from the very first season of the X-Files. Tooms also kills in cycles, but it's every 30 years, and he feeds on livers of his victims until he's eaten enough to go back into hibernation and start the process all over again. There's another reference to Kolchak in the season 10 episode, Mulder and Scully Meet the Were-Monster. In that episode, the character, Guy Mann, and yes, that is his name, wears a getup that looks a lot like Kolchak's. Even though Jeff Rice owned the rights to the Kolchak novels, Universal owned the television series rights, and ABC owned the rights to the 2 movies in character, ABC and longtime X-Files producer Frank Spotnitz would create a reboot of the series called Night Stalker. The series starred Stuart Townsend in the role of Carl Kolchak. However, due to very low ratings, the show was cancelled less than 2 months after it debuted. In 2012, Disney announced that a new film was in the works, with Johnny Depp taking over the role of Kolchak and Edgar Wright of Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz fame directing. This was back when Disney wasn't complete garbage and didn't blacklist Johnny Depp over something he didn't actually do. Unfortunately, we lost Darren McGavin back in 2006, but his legacy lives on with Kolchak and everything it's inspired. And let's not forget the 24-hour marathons of A Christmas Story. But anyways, what are your thoughts on Kolchak the Night Stalker? Have you seen the TV films or have you seen the series? Let me know down in the comments. Anyways, that's all for today, folks, but please check back soon as we continue our dive into the weird and spooky.